So in this video, I wanted to chat about one of the biggest bugbears I have at work, you probably have at work, other people have at work, which is just about kind of unnecessary or pointless meetings. So I'm gonna have a chat to you about some of the things you can do to bring focus to a meeting, and also make sure that they're basically not time-wasting, life-sucking kind of awful things that we all have to kind of endure. So yeah, grab a coffee and we'll get into it. So the first thing is, if a meeting gets set up or put in your diary or gets sent an invite and there's no agenda, ask for one. And it's really important to do that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if it is something important, it's going to allow you to prep for it and get the right element, but also it starts to focus the mind of the person who's actually setting up the meeting. So understanding what is the purpose of this meeting. Is it just to share information? If it's just something that needs to be updated on, that can probably be an email or a memo, and just ask them to do that. If it's something that's going to involve like brainstorming, or they want to kind of just like spitball ideas or whatever, then actually say, are the right people going to be at that meeting, or actually, you know, kind of have we got the right people around the table? Because there's nothing worse than having a meeting and then realising halfway through that the right people aren't there, or someone who's really important in a conversation isn't going to be represented. So, and equally, push back if people start dropping out of meetings or can't attend them. It's probably better just to reschedule it rather than trying to limp on with kind of half the people who did turn up. If it's in a meeting which needs like a formal decision, or we need an output, again, make sure are the right people going to be in the meeting to make that decision effectively, and or have you got the right information, papers, information, pre-work done before you get to that meeting. Sometimes I see that meetings are used to do work in, which isn't really kind of the point of them. The point is that there should be there for like, we should do all the pre-work beforehand, and this should just be a summary and a kind of move on. So making sure that those meetings don't drag into hours where we're kind of having to work through everyone's views on something or try and get like everyone's input. So making sure that it's kind of succinct about what we're trying to do in that particular meeting. And I guess that's one of the other behaviours that we see a lot is meetings, particularly in-person meetings. It happens slightly less with like Zoom or Teams meetings, but everyone feels like they need to make a point to be showed like why they're in that meeting room. So try and kind of structure the meeting that if you need specific people's input on specific points, you signal that either on the agenda or the papers, and make sure that they're briefed in advance, rather than everyone feeling like they need to dive in on everything. And I'm sure you've got them in your workplace. I've definitely got them where I am. Some people who feel like they need to give a view on everything, even if it's not particularly relevant. Some people who just repeat someone else's view. Again, it's not really relevant. So just making sure that you've got the right people in the room to make that meeting really as targeted and focused as it can be, and not just a general talking shop or people airing their views. If there's no agenda or there's no papers, then just push back and say, does this really need to be a meeting, and kind of get their view on it. And don't be afraid to kind of have that conversation. People are going to thank you for it. No one wants another meeting. So just making sure that you're pushing back on it and being proactive with your time management. If it is a meeting and there are papers, then you need to make sure that you prepare in advance. Quite often I see behaviours where people haven't read the papers, then they expect to be walked through them, and then they kind of ask questions which are like answered later in the pack. And again, that's a bit of a time sucker meetings and people lose focus. So make sure if you're going to a meeting that you've read the papers and you've prepared in advance. So that's not only thinking about what questions you want to have answered, and if I really want to make a good impression, I'll send those questions in advance, because people like to be like briefed and also have a view. So don't try and just kind of ambush someone in a meeting. Make sure that they've got time to prepare and have a structured answer, which again is going to make a meeting more focused. What I see in a lot of meetings is people going, I don't know the detail on that, I don't know about that, I'm going to have to come back to you, which again lengthens the meeting, but also means that you don't actually get to a resolution in that meeting. You then have to have another meeting. So by reading the papers and having had a look at the pack and knowing what your questions are, sending them in advance just means that people are ready with an answer in that meeting, and you can kind of move on to the next thing. Also, by reading the papers, what you're able to do is think about if there's anyone else's opinion or input that you want, either in the meeting or before. So actually, if there's something going on and you actually have heard about it somewhere else and you want to get their view, it allows you to have those pre-conversations. Whereas if you don't read the pack, or only read the pack like half an hour before you go into a meeting, it doesn't give you those chance to like have those pre-conversations. And there's nothing worse than trying to get hold of someone 5 minutes before you're going into a meeting to get an answer, and then they're not available, or, you know, kind of can't give you the answer on the spot. So again, read the papers as soon as you can, as soon as they come out, instead of waiting till very close to the meeting. at the start of the meeting, it's useful just to reiterate like what is the purpose of the meeting. So what are we here to do? What's the core business that we need to get done? What's the core decision that we need to have? So again, it focuses everyone's mind in the meeting about why we're here, but also sets the scene so you can kind of start to shut down any unnecessary conversations or any sidebars that are happening, and just make sure that you can be really focused when you're in the meeting, and hopefully it can therefore be a bit shorter. I would do that even if it's not my own meeting. So I would ask a question of the meeting chair or the person who's running the meeting, like, just to be clear, Sharon, why are we here today? What are the key outcomes you want from us, or what are the key decisions? So it just opens up that conversation. So if it's your meeting, you can state it, or if it's not your meeting, don't be afraid to ask the question before you kind of get into the business, just so that everyone's kind of signaled about what we're here to do. Another thing that kind of often creates us to lose focus in meetings, or let's be honest, makes people's attention span shut off, is about the way that people present their topics or their papers in meetings. So if you're presenting a paper, I would give a short, sharp summary of what you're going to cover, what to expect, what the key information is, and then what you need from the audience or the people that are listening to your presentation. It signals them to know that what the kind of core elements are, but equally what's known for them. Sometimes I see bad presentation of papers, which is like people talk through in length and in depth. If you're going to do that, there's no point of putting a paper in if you're just going to walk everyone through every line. You've probably seen it on a PowerPoint slide where people talk you through every single bullet point. It's kind of like, it's bad presentation. So being very short and sharp, giving an executive summary of what's in the paper, and signalling what the key risks, what the key issues, what do you need decisions on, rather than reiterating the detail of what's in the paper. If people have prepped properly, then that's going to be better. If not, then really you're signaling to let them what they should be concerned about, rather than getting distracted by some of the detail that's in there. If you're not presenting a paper, but you see someone who is doing some of those behaviours, again, don't be afraid to kind of ask a constructive question to shut down the amount of time that they need to talk. So, thanks, that's really useful. Can I just check what is the key point you want us to take away from that paper? Or thanks, that was a really good summary. However, what I'm not quite sure on is what the ask is for this meeting, or what you need from us. So it's about asking them exactly what they need to take away from the paper, and then allow the conversation not to get too distracted in the room by some of the superfluous information that may have happened. And over time, what hopefully that will do is people will get to learn good practice when it comes to presenting papers. And again, outside of the meeting, don't be afraid to offer some coaching for someone. If you're in a meeting where someone like repeatedly doesn't present papers very well, either they're very long and very boring, or they don't give enough information, or they don't give the right information, perhaps either speak to them directly if that's appropriate, or speak to their manager and just try and get them some coaching or some development to allow them to get better at that. Of course, it's all a question of practice, and we all get better as we do it, but some people need some interventions to make sure they're really effective. And if you're sitting in a meeting with 20 people and they're all listening to someone who's not very good at presenting, everyone's going to become disengaged, and that's a waste of time. You know, if you were to kind of multiply the cost of 20 people sitting in a meeting for half an hour when they don't need to be, then that's going to be productive time lost for your organisation. So again, helping to signal people to be better at doing this, or perhaps providing support and guidance on how to do that, is going to make all the meetings that you're in more focused and more effective. One way to check if people are kind of losing interest or focus is just watching like their body language. And of course, that's easier in physical rooms, people who are kind of checking their phone, doodling, not really engaging, a lack of eye contact, perhaps some fidgeting. And in fact, some of that on Zoom or Teams, you can still see people who kind of appear distracted, people who perhaps aren't engaging, asking questions, making comments. And then you can start to know if you're losing the room. And if you start to lose the room, then it's usually useful to try and draw the conversation to a close, because you're not getting the best from people. So if you start to notice that perhaps the body language in the room is changing, or on Teams, or people don't seem engaged, you can say something like, I suggest we leave it there, and we can move on to the next section of the agenda. Or you can say, I think we've spoken enough on that, Susan, now. I think we should be able to move on. But just make sure that you don't lose the pace of the meeting by people getting distracted. Because once you start to lose focus or lose the engagement, it's really difficult to get that back. So watch out for some of those signs, either if you're presenting or if others are, just so that you can pull the meeting back if it's losing its momentum. The next thing I often see in meetings is people who don't ask the right type of questions. So if you're in a position where you can ask questions, make sure that they are the right types. And equally, if you see someone who's kind of asking the wrong types of questions, it might be some feedback for them or some learning for them in terms of how you can make sure that meetings are focused. So some of the strategic questions you can ask are, what are the core aims of this paper? Or what are the core aims of this project that you're trying to get across? Just so that everyone can understand how that fits into the wider business strategy. If it doesn't, then you can perhaps provide the challenge of, is this a good use of our time and resources? The other question I really like at a strategic level is, how can this be applied wider than this specific project, or how does this apply to other business areas? So again, you're thinking at a strategic level across an organisation rather than thinking about things in isolation. The next are around resourcing questions. So if someone's presented a paper or a topic for decision, asking how can we help, or what do you need from us? And that allows them to be clear about what the ask is. But then if actually they don't need anything from you, then perhaps it's again some feedback about, why has this come to this meeting, or why do we have to have a meeting on this? Because actually, if you don't need anything from us, then what's kind of the point really? The second question I like to ask is, what resources do you need from us to make this happen? Or what resources generally do you need to make this happen? Sometimes we're really good in papers about saying what we want to achieve, but we don't necessarily identify what the obstacles to doing that. And when I see things fail, it's often because we haven't thought about what are the other enabling factors or resources that we need, either in time, money, focus, to make sure things get over the line. And the thing is, if things don't get over the line and they drag on, you're going to have more meetings on this. And it just kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you can be very clear about like, what's the ask, what do you need from us, and what the resources are going to help you get this over the line, it's going to make everything more successful. And the final type of question that I really like in meetings to ensure there's focus is also recognition. So who has helped on this, or how has this been really successful? So recognising the positives of the projects and making sure that we're not just focusing on kind of the negative elements, but there is some kind of positive recognition as part of these is another way of getting engagement and focus, particularly if someone shouts out someone else in the room or says that another team's been particularly helpful. It's going to foster a more collaborative culture as you go forward. If in a meeting you feel like things are kind of going off piece, don't be afraid to interject. So sometimes what happens is it becomes talking shops for a wide range of other issues, and although they're interesting, they're not really relevant to what you're talking about. So don't be afraid to interject with phrases such as like, I think that's really interesting, let's take that offline. Or I think that's relevant, but doesn't really kind of impact on this project, so why don't we come back to it? Or perhaps say, I think that's probably a side meeting that'd be useful to have X, Y, and Z in, so let's set that up and move on. So it allows, rather than people just airing general grievances or things that they kind of think aren't perfect, or perhaps things that kind of are slightly related but really need to be dealt with in a more in-depth way somewhere else. But don't be afraid to kind of interject. Everyone in the meeting is going to thank you for that. They are probably thinking the exact same thing, but haven't got the confidence to say it. Often in meetings, there's like a lot of emperor's new clothes type vibes about it, and people kind of don't want to be the one who points something out, but as soon as someone else does, they're really grateful. So if something's not really clear or something's not really relevant, don't be afraid to call it out, because most people will probably thank you for it. And the final thing about making sure that meetings have got focus is making sure that there's clear action steps and what's going to happen after the meeting. So sometimes I've left meetings where we've had really good constructive conversation, but what we haven't nailed down is what are the action steps? Who's going to do what next? By when? How the timeframes are going to work? So if you get to the end of the meeting and that hasn't happened, ask the question, okay, how do we monitor this? How do we know it's happening? What are the next action steps? Or if it's not appropriate, or it's not your meeting, you don't have a chance to do that, then don't be afraid to follow it up with an email after the meeting just saying, great conversation today, guys, but what I would appreciate is greater clarity on what we're doing next. And then that just allows that to kind of get formalised and make sure that there is a point to the meeting. There's actually been an outcome to the meeting. And, of course, there is a connection and a collaboration issue with meetings that means it's good for us to get together. But we all know there are way too many meetings in the working week, and often there aren't very clear outputs or outcomes from them. So hopefully I've given some tips and tricks in this video to help give more focus to meetings and ultimately push back and say, is this meeting effective? Do we need to have it? If not, is there a better way for us to do this? And by doing that, you're going to be freeing up so much time and resources and ultimately energy for people to be able to tackle what's really important to them. I'm Liz, and here on my channel we talk about management and leadership issues and tips and tricks to help you navigate your career with more confidence and to perhaps avoid some of the pitfalls and challenges that I've seen over the years. I'd love you to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.